Welcome back. I'm Steph Smart and I'm here with Paul Blackburn, and we are going to talk about shock and how people react differently after natural disasters and traumatic events.
Yeah, shock is a big thing. Really, if you dive into some cold water, you're going to get a shock.
Yep.
And really, if you want to understand shock, it's basically that kind of like we pull our shoulders in, we get our elbows close to our body, our chest cage, our rib cage, and we kind of go, whoa! And it's that whole kind of like, I'm adjusting to change. You might actually like it in the water. You might like that fresh dive into the water, but it's still shock. So what we're talking about in a natural disaster like this is that shock is a much more severe, much more powerful, lasts much longer, and the researchers have actually studied it and said, okay, so there's a series of sequences we go through. The first that most people go through is that the shock creates numbness, and so if you were to knock on the door of somebody and say, your daughter just got killed in a car smash, the first thing they'd say is no.
Yep.
So that's kind of like this can't be true. Maybe I'm in a dream. No, start again. There's kind of like a complete refusal to deal with it. After that, and that's a natural thing. Someone who's quite used to that, someone who deals in trauma all the time. Say, for example, a paramedic, and they, on average, paramedics see 2 to 3 people die per day. If it happens within their family, they still go through the same thing. They know this hasn't happened kind of a thing. In a disaster like this, we can't go through the no, it hasn't happened thing because everywhere we look, we see the devastation around us. And so the shock is much more permanent, much deeper, and takes many people a long time to get through because that first reaction about no, it hasn't happened, obviously they know that they're not telling the truth to themselves because they're looking right at it. So what they go through is to go straight into, I'm okay.
Yep.
And so the shock hasn't actually penetrated through their body. And I'd say now, a month after the major event, which was probably 3, 4, 5 day extended event, so it's not like it was just over and done with in one go. So that was shock after shock after shock. As it got worse and worse, and the rain kept coming, and the depth of the devastation was revealed, then that's multiple shocks.
Yeah.
So a little bit like a volcano going off, there are aftershocks, they add up, and quite often the ones that are after add up to much more than the first one. But people who took a hit on the first day probably took another hit the second day. And as you know, if we were talking about a boxing match, the more hits, the sooner you're going to go down. Nevertheless, you'll watch boxers get knocked down and they'll stand up and say, no, I'm okay, I'm okay, I'm okay.
Yep.
So it's part of our instinct as a human being. Probably stronger in the mulga and in the Gidgee than it is in the cities, but nevertheless, I'm okay, we'll be out there. You'd have to be a little bit suspicious of it because this is a shock at a massive level. No matter which way you cut this thing up and look at it, it's probably one of the biggest natural disasters in Australian history. And so I'm okay is probably not necessarily true, but it's nevertheless an instinctive thing that we say. If we do that, when we get through the denial that has happened, like I said, that most people are going to get through that pretty quick because they had to live through it for a week while it was actually happening. Then what happens is you're going to have an outpouring of emotions. And so after the initial shock and numbness, then comes a kaleidoscope of emotions. And so you'll see everything. You'll see people who are so angry that it's rage, which is why we call it road rage, is it, just kind of comes pouring out, triggered by some person driving crazy. Other people are not going to be angry at all. They're just going to be a massive, overwhelming sadness. They'll cry at the drop of a hat. The cat gets run over and they're in tears for a week about it. It's not really the cat. The cat was a triggering event, and the built-up sadness just overwhelms and goes on for ages. Other people are going to be petrified. They're just going to be shocked. And people coming back from war, we talk about shell shock, and that's a shock of yet another bomb goes off close enough to disorient them. It takes away their hearing, and it shocks. The air pressure is amazing. They take a hit, and then another one, etc. Some people will be feeling shame or guilt. There's a thing called survivor guilt, which is where people feel like, but I didn't get hit so bad, my mate down the road is heaps worse than me. And so
there's a lot of that going on. People I talk to say, how are you going? And they'll say, look, we're going to be okay, but, our neighbours down the road, they've lost nearly everything.
Yeah, and it's a really difficult thing because we start to feel a bit of shame about having any emotions at all, because you'll notice what you said. Oh, yeah, we're going to be okay. Gonna be might be 5 years to 10 years away.
Yeah.
So we're going to be okay. That doesn't mean we are okay.
Yeah.
What it means is what I feel, I'm kind of feeling like I'm not allowed to feel it because your mate down the road's lost everything. So survivor guilt is this kind of concept of I feel bad, but I'm not allowed to, and I shouldn't because I got off lightly, so to speak. It is a difficult thing to deal with. Nevertheless, that outpouring of emotions needs to be facilitated. The biggest advice that I could give anybody is to understand that if there is rage there, then get out and chop some wood. Do something that involves a physical action where it's like punching. Of course, it's never going to be satisfactory to bring your anger out on another human being because they're going to suffer. Lots of kids are going to be traumatised in the upcoming year or two just because they see their parents struggling and the kids are wondering whether they're safe or not and whether they're going to be okay. I've heard parents saying to me that their kids have said, are we going to be all right because you said we've got no money? And they were just actually asking who's got some cash in their wallet. So it wasn't a question about whether there was money available, but the kids interpret things in what can be very negative. Kids tend to overwhelmingly take responsibility for things that are not theirs.
Yep.
So watch your kids under about 10 or 11 years of age. For reasons beyond any kind of logic, they are likely to pick up responsibility for difficulties that mum and dad or aunties and uncles or friends are going through and somehow feel guilty or ashamed that that it's somehow their fault. Like I said, there's no rhyme or reason, no rationale to this, but we know it happens. We know it happens every day of the week. So, even if you look at marital split-ups and, if you look at that kind of a thing, what we'll see is the divorce rate is going to spike over the next 5 years.
Yep.
And that's because there's extra stress. So anything that was under pressure is going to be now under more pressure. And so we're going to have couples struggling, we're going to have kids struggling, we're going to have all sorts of struggling going on like that. So that massive outpouring of emotion needs to be facilitated. If you bottle it up, it simply means that there's an outburst later where bad behaviour happens. And quite often people strike out and then wish that they didn't.
Yep.
Our emotions get so far out of control. What you should know is that 80% of murder in Australia is domestic. So, we don't need to be worried about external threats. We need to be worried about the person we sleep with more than anybody else. So that's just emotions out of control. So people going through shock go through this emotional outpouring, which they may or may not be able to do.
Yep.
Secondly, then, once they get through that, and that might be just how quick can they bottle it up, then they'll go to bargaining, and that is, I would trade my life for my child who was lost or whatever. Essentially, the place where we've got to get to with shock is to facilitate expression of emotion. That means if you walk in the room and you find your wife in tears, you need to sit down beside her and just be with her and not talk.
Yeah.
Because when you say, what's wrong with you, hun? You're looking for a solution, and really she doesn't want a solution. She wants to be able to vent.
Yep.
And so for the bloke who needs to punch something, get him a punching bag. For the person who's just terrified, make them safe. It's really basically a matter of allowing the emotion to run without anybody copping it or being diminished or belittled or demeaned or made smaller or laughed at or made fun of. When we allow people to feel what they feel, it passes.
Okay.
And so an emotion experienced dissipates.
Yep.
An emotion not experienced, an emotion resisted, bottles up.
Yep.
Once it bottles up, we're just waiting for the explosion.
Yep.
But the place we've got to get to is acceptance. Once we can accept that this is what's happened, then we can start thinking about what to do. When I was doing the work in the bushfires in Canberra in 2003, there were two types of people predominantly. Those who were wishing that it didn't happen. Those who were saying that the government should have organised the firefighters in a different way, those kind of things. Basically, they are people who are looking backwards and saying it shouldn't have happened. The other group were the people saying, I don't like what's happened, but what have I got to do now? I've got to go and talk to the insurance companies. Have I got to deal with the bank? What have we got to do here? How do we move forward? So the people who could get to acceptance, not to say that it's okay, but to accept that this is what's happened and we need to move forward, those are the people who win. It could take a little while to get there.
Yep.
Understand that when I say, okay, so we start with I'm okay and denial, and when we work our way down into massive outpourings and bargaining, we can cycle up and down for years. I know some people come to me after 20 years of that. You could say post-traumatic stress disorder is actually the inability to cope with the shock that took place in a traumatic situation. That means that it could be going on 25 and 30 years later. We've got a big problem in our armed forces with people who go into war zones. The PTSD is not diagnosed because, it's a masculine environment and it's kind of like just, drink a cup of concrete and toughen up. And not dealt with, and those people are still suffering 30 years later.
So, what you're saying is that there really is no time limit for people to move through these stages of grief. And it doesn't really matter, I guess, how much people have lost. They can still have a big emotional response.
The degree of loss is irrelevant. You could lose a little thing and be unable to recover. You could lose a lot and be fine. So and the time period is infinite. So there's, there are people who will not recover from this ever, emotionally, and they'll go to their graves still carrying these wounds.
So, Paul, can you give us some tools and strategies of how you can look after people that are going through shock or trauma?
The major thing with shock or trauma is to encourage the emotion that you see being displayed. What that means is you've got to take time out. This is not a thing that you can do by saying she'll be right. You can't say, look, there's a silver lining somewhere. The platitudes are going to make everything worse. Therefore, the thing that works is to be with this person. Primarily, there's probably only a dozen to 25 or 30 people in your life you can actually do this with, because it depends on pre-existing relationship. But what that means is your mother, your brother, your sister, your auntie, your uncle, your mate down the road, sometimes you just got to take them out for coffee, or you got to take them down and have a beer and just sit and just be with the feeling. And the way that works for me professionally is I say, tell me more about that. So when they say, I'm feeling a bit shit, I go, really that's not helpful. I'm feeling a bit shit. It's not really a full description. Then I'll say, okay, so tell me more about that. Or what do you mean by that? Or how does that show up for you? Or what is the name that you would give that? So basically, if I'm willing to sit with you, if you've been through some kind of trauma and I'm willing to sit with you, make sure that you feel safe, and that and then just ask you to tell me what it is that you're feeling and going through. Most people are going to say, I don't know. What we need to do is say things like, well, if you did know, what would that be like? Or if you had to describe it to your best friend, what would you say? Does it get you? Go for physical sensations. Do you feel it in your torso? Do you feel it in your belly? Get people to put into words whatever is going on for them now. I've talked about this before in the intro, that men and women feel things differently. That's obvious, but they express them differently as well. So it's a matter of finding the language that works for whoever you're talking to, being with them. Sometimes we can just sit in silence, and that's a better thing than opening your mouth and buggering it up. So really it's just to be there.
Okay, thanks, Paul. I think we've covered everything that we need to cover on shock.
Bearing in mind that it's a work in progress,
Yep.